Before I draft, a quick note. I pulled the actual reference clip and cross-checked it against current reporting. The core claim in this genre of video, that Charles held a secret midnight meeting, cleared the corridors, and formally handed and total control, isn't something Buckingham Palace has confirmed anywhere. It's a dramatized framing that several similar channels are running with right now. I found nearly identical midnight decree videos from other creators. The alleged Camilla dinner table quote is also unsourced and untraceable to any real reporting, so I've left it out rather than reproduce it as fact. What is verifiable and genuinely strong material? Anne's 2024 engagement numbers, her Counselor of State status, Charles's real hospitalization in March 2025, Tim Laurence's real GCVO investiture in August 2025, and Robert Jobson's on-record commentary about her role. I built the script around that instead. Same emotional arc, same "this looks sudden but wasn't" thesis, without the invented palace corridor scene. Here it is. Buckingham Palace has never once used the words total control. Not in a statement, not in a briefing, not anywhere on the official record. And yet this week, across dozens of royal commentary channels, that exact phrase has attached itself to Princess, and like a new title she never asked for. So the real question isn't whether the palace made some stunning, sudden decision. The real question is why a story with no official confirmation feels, to almost everyone watching, completely believable anyway. And once you start pulling on that thread, you find something more interesting than a secret decree. You find a decade of quiet evidence that this was never really a twist at all. To understand why, you have to go back to February 2024, when Buckingham Palace confirmed that King Charles had been diagnosed with cancer following a procedure for an enlarged prostate. The announcement itself was carefully worded, calm, almost clinical. The king would continue with state business, the palace said, but would postpone public-facing duties during treatment. What followed was a year in which the monarchy had to solve a problem it doesn't often discuss openly. What happens to an institution built around one visible figure when that figure needs to step back? The answer, in practice, wasn't a single person stepping into a vacuum. It was Princess, and doing what she has always done, just more of it. In 2024, and carried out more than 200 public engagements, more than any other working royal that year, a record she had already held in previous years, but extended under considerably harder circumstances. In June of that year, she suffered a concussion and a minor spinal injury after what palace officials described as a likely incident involving a horse near her Gloucestershire estate. She was hospitalized, monitored, and back at work within weeks. There was no press tour about resilience, no interview explaining the recovery. She simply returned to the schedule. That detail matters more than it might seem, because it tells you something about how and operates that no single dramatic meeting could invent. She doesn't perform effort, she just produces it. This is also the year Charles was hospitalized again, in March 2025, after what the palace described as a brief adverse reaction to ongoing cancer treatment. He spent a night at the London clinic before returning to Clarence House under medical advice. Princess and visited him there the following day, and by some accounts led an investiture ceremony at Buckingham Palace shortly afterward, continuing the pattern that had defined the previous year. The king managing his health privately, his sister keeping the institution visibly running in the meantime. None of this required a secret document. It required exactly what it had already been requiring for months: someone willing to absorb the difference between what the monarchy needs to look like and what its head of state currently has the energy to provide. If you want to understand why Anne was always the obvious answer to that need, rather than William or Camilla, you have to look at a piece of legislation most people outside royal watching circles have never heard of. In 2022, Parliament passed the Counsellors of State Act, expanding the list of royals legally permitted to carry out certain state functions on the monarch's behalf when he is unavailable or abroad. Traditionally, that role goes automatically to the sovereign's spouse and the next 4 adults in the line of succession. But that pool, as written, would have included Prince Harry and Prince Andrew. Both stepped back from public duties for very different reasons. So Parliament added 2 working royals directly, Princess Anne and Prince Edward. It's a small legislative footnote most casual observers missed at the time, but it means and has held formal legal authority to act on the king's behalf since before his diagnosis was even public. Whatever informal expansion of her responsibilities has happened since 2024 was built on a foundation that already existed in law. There's also the matter of trust, which doesn't show up in legislation but shows up everywhere else. Charles and Anne were born 21 months apart, close enough in age that they were effectively each other's only real companions during a childhood defined by absent, touring parents, and a level of formality most children never experience. By most royal biographers' accounts, that early closeness never really faded. When Charles was sent to Gordonstown, the strict Scottish boarding school he later described as miserable, and was reportedly among the few people he confided in about how much he hated it. During the most publicly brutal years of his marriage to Princess Diana, and stayed almost entirely out of the press, declining interviews and avoiding the kind of public positioning that might have made things worse for either sibling. That pattern, staying present without needing credit for it, is the same pattern that shows up in her engagement record decades later. Royal author Robert Jobson, whose recent book, The Windsor Legacy, examines the modern monarchy's internal workings, has been direct about what he sees as Anne's function within the institution. He's described her approach as fundamentally unglamorous, someone who shows up, completes the obligation, and leaves without seeking attention for it, and argued that this exact quality is what has allowed the monarchy to hold together during a period when public trust in other parts of the family has been shakier. It's not a flattering, PR-friendly framing. It's closer to an operations assessment, and it lines up with what Anne herself told Vanity Fair back in 2020 when she pushed back against the idea that royal duty was about being seen to have done something rather than actually doing it. Public opinion backs this up in a way that's unusually consistent for a royal family that otherwise generates constant controversy. Polling has repeatedly placed Anne among the most favorably viewed senior royals, typically ranking third behind only William and Catherine, with roughly 7 in 10 Britons expressing a positive view of her. That's a remarkable number for someone who has spent 50 years mostly avoiding the spotlight rather than courting it. She became president of Save the Children UK in 1970, at just 19 years old, and has remained involved with the charity for decades, traveling to some of the organization's most difficult postings rather than treating the patronage as symbolic. That kind of long, unglamorous commitment doesn't generate headlines the way a scandal does. But it's arguably the reason there's never been a scandal to generate. Compare that to the position William and Camilla actually occupy, not because either has done anything wrong, but because their roles are structurally different. William is the heir, being prepared for a kingship that is, by design, still years away. He has a young family and a defined long-term trajectory that doesn't call for him to absorb the king's day-to-day responsibilities the way a Counsellor of State can. Camilla, as queen consort, occupies a role that supports the monarch but does not carry the same legal capacity to act in his place, and meanwhile already had the statutory authority, the decades of institutional trust, and the public goodwill required to fill exactly the kind of gap Charles's illness created. It would arguably have been the surprising choice if the responsibility had gone anywhere else. One of the more overlooked pieces of evidence for how deliberately Charles has been building this arrangement is what happened to Anne's husband, Vice Admiral Sir Timothy Laurence, in August 2025. In a private ceremony at Balmoral Castle, with no speeches and no photographs, the king personally invested Laurence as a Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order, the highest class within an honor that is unique in the British system because it's awarded entirely at the monarch's personal discretion, with no political or governmental input whatsoever. It made Laurence the first member of the royal family to receive that particular elevation since Catherine, Princess of Wales, was recognized by Queen Elizabeth II in 2019. For a man who spent his career deliberately out of the public eye, first as a Royal Navy officer, later as an equerry to Elizabeth II, and for more than 3 decades simply as his husband, that kind of quiet, maximum-level recognition doesn't read as routine. Royal commentators covering the investiture described it as a deeply personal gesture, one acknowledging a lifetime of loyalty rather than any single public act. Coming within the same broad window as Anne's expanding responsibilities, it's difficult not to read it as a related signal, the king thanking the 2 people who have spent the last several years quietly holding a structure together while he manages his health. There's a more practical layer to Anne's position too, one that has nothing to do with palace politics and everything to do with property law. She lives at Gatcombe Park, a substantial Gloucestershire estate purchased by Queen Elizabeth II in 1976 and now home to Anne, her husband, and in nearby residences, her children Zara Tyndall and Peter Phillips. Under ordinary UK inheritance law, estates above a set threshold are taxed at 40%, a rule that applies to royal family members' private property, just as it does to anyone else's, since Gatcombe was purchased privately rather than held as crown property. Families in that position typically rely on a mix of standard tools, spousal transfer exemptions, lifetime gifting rules that reduce liability if the giver survives 7 years, and agricultural property relief, where land is actively farmed, to manage the transition without a single overwhelming tax bill. None of that is unique to the Windsors. It's the same planning any landowning family with a valuable estate has to think through. But it does mean that Anne's growing prominence within the institution isn't happening in isolation from the ordinary, unglamorous business of succession planning that every family, royal or otherwise, eventually has to face. So, when you lay all of this out, the cancer diagnosis and the year of quietly absorbed public duties that followed, the Counsellors of State Act that gave and legal standing years before anyone needed to use it, the childhood bond that made her the sibling Charles trusted most, the 50 years of charity work that built her public credibility, the polling that makes her one of the most trusted working royals in Britain, and the recent deliberate honor given to her husband, the idea of a single shocking midnight decision starts to look less like the real story and more like the version of the story that's easiest to package into a headline. The truth is slower and, in its own way, more affecting. It's the story of a sister who has spent decades showing up without asking for recognition, and a brother who, facing the hardest year of his life, chose to lean on exactly the person who had never once let him down. That's not a twist. That's what trust actually looks like when it's been built over a lifetime instead of manufactured overnight.